Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the program. My name is William Hemsworth. Great to be with you. Pleased to welcome my guest back to the program, Dr. Sam Rocha. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia, author, podcaster, has a great new podcast called Folk Phenomenology. Sam, how are you doing today?
Doing good, William. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. I hope you don't mind that I abridged your bio a little bit.
I'm glad you did. Thank you.
All right. So I guess real quick, let's talk about your podcast real quick because that just recently launched. What's the feedback been like on it?
You know, right now we've launched a trailer, which is kind of like a teaser
Mhm.
that features the voices of the 12 core interviews that make up the season. So I'm releasing it as a season, so it's like 20 episodes. And then I did a prequel episode, which is really the result of being in the forest with my daughter, collecting some field recordings for the show, and her asking me a ton of questions, and me being like, "You want to ask me these questions on a microphone?" and give people a chance to kind of interrogate the show through a 7-year-old girl's eyes and ears and mind. So that released this week, and my only fear is that the lack of my daughter on the show on the rest of the episodes is going to put it in the tank because everyone loves her so much that I'm a little intimidated now because the first episode is a monologue, so it's just me, and then I'm interviewing folks. But with respect to all the people I interviewed, I don't know if anybody's quite as cute as my little daughter.
Yeah, I was looking on Twitter and everyone was like loving the question she was asking you. So thought I'd
Yeah,
ask about it.
yeah.
But I invited you on today to talk about critical race theory. Obviously, that could be a little, well, to say the least, controversial. Um, but maybe you give us a background of what critical race theory is.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I like to describe critical race theory historically. So, if we look at the history of legal racial struggles, you could start perhaps with the state of Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania being the first American state to abolish slavery. They were the first one to do it. And it used to be the case that the U.S. Capitol was in Philadelphia, before it was in D.C. And so there was some things where, like Jefferson and Washington, they were slave owners, and the enslaved peoples they had often came with them to Philadelphia, but they would have to go back to Virginia, otherwise they would be freed under the statutes that Philadelphia had passed as a free state. But ever since that, those laws that made Philadelphia a freed state, there were other laws, other states that created their own laws, and of course, the transatlantic slave trade was actually first shipping was banned. You couldn't use ships within the transatlantic slave trade in like the very very early 19th century, and then I think in 1808 the transatlantic slave trade was legally abolished. It happened a little bit, but then and that made chattel slavery replace the transatlantic slave trade. So all of a sudden, plantations and slave owners started to create a kind of chattel slave economy that was local rather than an import export economy. And that takes us all the way up to the Civil War, what many people call Black Reconstruction, which was really the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment made the Emancipation Proclamation become law. The 14th Amendment added citizenship to freedom, and the 15th Amendment gave the vote to the freed and enslaved peoples. And that story continues. Right after the Reconstruction Amendments, there was a big Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And that's the separate but equal clause that got built. And that was kind of a backlash against the Reconstruction. And so there was a big organization called the NAACP that got started in the very early 20th century. People like Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, many other activists. They started off in Niagara, actually, in Canada, because they wanted to have an integrated meeting, and they weren't able to do that in the United States. So they wanted to have a mixed race meeting between
Okay.
white folk and black folk at the time. And so they did that. That was called the Niagara Movement, and that became the NAACP. And what that created was the foundations upon which the NAACP became kind of like a legal activism organization that challenged laws. And the most famous law and the biggest success of the NAACP didn't come until 1954 at Brown v. Board of Education, where a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall argued before the Supreme Court and won that case on behalf of school integration. The reason this story is really important is because critical race theory is what I would call post-civil rights legal theory. So all these legal changes, from the legal changes that made Pennsylvania a free state, all the way through Reconstruction and the Articles of the Constitution, all the way into the foundation of the NAACP, all the way to 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. We get to the 1960s, and you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you also have Thurgood Marshall, who takes his place on the Supreme Court, appointed there by Kennedy, I think in 66, 67. But then in 68, Martin Luther King gets killed. And a lot of people saw that as a death blow, as kind of the equivalent of Plessy versus Ferguson after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Like the face of the movement is dead for the most part, or
he's dead. And Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Housing Act, which is kind of seen as the bookend to the civil rights movement's law that went into law. And he did it. Well, he did it because it was the right thing to do, and there was a lot of movement towards it. But I think he also did it to try to offer something in the aftermath of the death of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. And so whenever we get into like the early 70s, there's a lot of questions as to how permanent is the civil rights movement going to be, because after emancipation we had Jim Crow, and now we've ended Jim Crow, at least on the books. What's going to come next? What's going to be next after that? And one of the people who really analyzed, you could say, Reconstruction through civil rights law was a legal scholar and lawyer who came up as a lawyer working for the NAACP under Thurgood Marshall, named Derek Bell. And Derek Bell, from Pennsylvania, from Pittsburgh, a lot of free state, roots there. He was a law professor in California, and he was recruited to Harvard, and he became the first African American tenured professor at Harvard Law School. And he had worked both as a lawyer, civil rights lawyer, with Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, and he'd also worked as a professor. And the early part of his career was analyzing all the case law related to race. And one thing he noticed was that mostly all the laws that were relevant to race, including protection against racism or discrimination, they rarely use racial language in their composition. So he wanted to analyze all this case law. And in 1973, he produced a book called Race, Racism, and American Law. And it was a review of a ton of case law that had never been really read before through the lens of race, where he brought it up. And there was small things like reading the dissenting opinion on Plessy versus Ferguson. He noted no one ever pays attention to that, but it's really important. And it's the one place where we hear someone talking about race. And so he published this case law book that would go through 8 editions from 1973 to the 1990s. And Derek Bell had a couple students, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and a few others. And he was eventually recruited to Oregon to be the dean of the law school over there. And whenever he left amidst a little bit of controversy related to some hiring practices that he was advocating for on behalf of some other folks in other departments. And there was also some student activism trying to say, well, if we're going to lose Derek Bell, let's at least get someone else who can do the kind of work that he was doing. Mm-hmm. And there was a workshop. And Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado, his students, they called it the Workshop in Critical Race Theory. And that was whenever the name Critical Race Theory was used, really as a way to capture that work that Derek Bell did after civil rights, analyzing civil rights, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, and then, of course, antebellum, chattel slavery, transatlantic slave trade, analyzing all of that stuff, but in particular American law, so from 1776 forward, when there was laws on the books under the nation. So critical race theory emerges in the early 80s under that name based on that legal scholarship. And one of the terms that's used in the legal scholarship, it calls it legal realism. And that was a school of thought that Bell brought to the table. What's interesting is that after that, in the 80s, there are disputes amongst critical race theorists. So Delgado was actually critical of Bell in certain ways, and Bell responded in other ways. And Crenshaw had some critiques as well, and Methuselah. And there was a bunch of folks who were having, like all schools of thought, a kind of rich dialogue. And it also spread a little bit outside of law. So it was very natural for education, for instance, because Brown v. Board of Education was one of the pivotal cases. So a lot of school law, a lot of school policy was already relevant to this stuff. And so critical race theory found itself, especially in the 1990s, people like Gloria Ladson Billings brought that to the analysis of school laws, educational policy, educational outcomes. And that's actually how I found out about it, because I work in a school of education, and even though I do philosophy, and I always say, like, Cornel West, who wrote Race Matters in like 1993, 94 or so, he's not a critical race theorist, but he has really important things to say about race. And he's more in my school of thought that, in my certainly approach to the question of race as a philosophy of race. But I knew of critical race theory because a lot of social scientists and a lot of people looking at school law and educational policy analysis, they were using it. So I kind of needed to learn a bit about it. And so that's how I came to know about it. But that's what critical race theory, that's why I think the best way to talk about it is as post-civil rights abolitionism. So it's an abolitionist approach to legal studies after the civil rights movement by someone who began it, in Derek Bell, who was a part of the civil rights law under Thurgood Marshall.
Okay. That's interesting. So I guess how does it get, what does it actually look at as far as organizations and theories, all that? I know you said abolitionism, but how does it actually do that?
Well, so the first, the desire of abolitionism going all the way back to Pennsylvania was to abolish slavery.
Sure.
And in Pennsylvania, obviously, Pennsylvania both abolished slavery, but also emancipated or guaranteed emancipation to African Americans. Emancipation doesn't necessarily mean full enfranchisement as citizens. So there were certain cases of fraction 7/8, 5/8, where they would actually divide the personhood of African Americans legally. A lot of that was actually to further enfranchise plantation owners so that they could vote on behalf of their enslaved people at a fraction number. The point I'm making is that, like, American law has litigated and maintained any number of degrees of distance from abolitionism. And even when it reached abolitionism or emancipation, it had a long ways to go to, like, giving full voting rights, for instance, to everyone and all those things. And so that's the tradition of abolitionism in the United States. It goes back to the 16th century, actually. Quakers, some of the biggest advocates actually on behalf of enslaved peoples in this country have been Quaker abolitionists and peoples who were a part of the revivals in the United States called the Great Awakenings, right? Mm-hmm. And so abolitionism is about the abolishment of the institution of slavery, and also the abolishment of all the institutions that tried to replace it. You'll notice one thing in the 13th Amendment. It's actually not the abolition of slavery. It's the abolition of slavery of forced servitude, is what it says, and everything except imprisonment. So there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that said that people who are in prison essentially lose a part of their status as citizens, and there you can have forced servitude. And so a lot of people are very critical of the industrial prison complex, and especially for-profit prisons that make use of this legal loophole that goes far as back as Reconstruction. And it's still there to this day. So abolitionism is that project all the way back to Pennsylvania being a free state, all the way to concerns about, for instance, voting rights. The Voting Rights Act, of course, was one of those civil rights acts from the 1960s that the Supreme Court has interpreted over a few different rulings to be maybe less relevant today than it was then, and that's a huge debate that's happening today. And that's the context of critical race theory. It's legal though, so it's not an analysis of society or of people. It's not sociology. It's law. So if you don't have a law to talk about, or at least like a policy or some kind of a political type document, then you just can't have critical race theory because it's not built for that. It's built for legal analysis.
Okay. So one of the things I've heard, and like I said, I've read a little bit about critical race theory, and I've talked to someone who is not for it. And then, of course, I'm talking to you as well, just to get
Yeah.
perspectives.
Did you talk to David?
I talked to David, yeah.
Yeah, I debate David on folk phenomenology about critical race theory.
I'll be talking with him again because my internet cut out.
Oh no!
So we had to cut it short.
Oh no! Okay.
But one of the things that I've heard, well, and read several places, is that critical race theory teaches that systemic racism is kind of entrenched in society. Can you kind of discuss that a little bit?
Sure. What it means by that isn't talking about like society in an ideal sense. It says that American society, since its founding, has had differences in the legal status of persons. And again, the best example here is just
the fractions.
Not only the fractions, but just the fact that like Pennsylvania stood alone over and against all the other states at that time, and guaranteed the freedom of all people within its state. Now, it couldn't make Virginia do that, and so these kinds of interstate disputes have had to be regulated and dealt with within courts of opinion. And so, like, one of the practical questions. Here's a kind of weird story. Jefferson and Washington had amazing personal chefs, like really good ones. Jefferson was trained in Paris. They were also both African American, and they were both enslaved by them. And so they had a real interest in keeping their ownership over their personal chefs, but they both needed to spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania, which was a free state. And so, but their home address was in Virginia. So one of the things they would have to arrange is that every 6 months or so, kind of like whenever you have a residency status that can only go so long, they would have to take their enslaved people out back to their home address and then bring them back in order to comply.
Reset the whole thing again.
Exactly, yeah. The reason I'm giving this example is that these kinds of laws that protect or don't protect, that include or don't include all people, have existed, and we've added entire amendments to our Constitution to try to rectify that situation. But every time those amendments have come in, there have been pushbacks, such as Plessy versus Ferguson, or before that, the Dred Scott case that was a little bit before the Civil War, which basically said, and the Dred Scott case is actually what most critical race scholars are referring to. The Dred Scott case ruled that the Constitution of the United States never intended to include African Americans in its status of personhood. That was a legal document that was settled Supreme Court law, and it drove a lot of precedent even after and during Reconstruction. It wasn't really until the Civil Rights, and that was how the Jim Crow South got away with so much of its things. Because you got to realize, like, Mississippi rewrote its entire constitution after emancipation to try to create back avenues where you could have slavery-ish working environments and arrangements. And the way they withstood the courts when they were challenged on these was by appealing to precedents such as the Dred Scott case, or later Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal clauses. That's why in the 1950s and 60s, whenever some of these cases started winning, it was a really, really big deal. So when critical race theory says systemic racism is a part of society, they say society are ruled by laws, and laws determine in many ways, you could say, the functioning of legal society, at least in a political jurisprudential sense. And race has been there from the very beginning. And so racism, and in particular in this case, anti-black forms of white supremacy, they have operated in American laws ever since there's been a nation state. Otherwise, why did all those signers of the Constitution own enslaved people? You see what I mean?
Right.
So whenever we're talking about systemic racism, it's not a moral judgment, to be honest. It's weird for people to hear this, but it's a legal, factual, empirical point that American law has existed on and has ruled on matters of race ever since 1776. Otherwise, there would be no Dred Scott case. There would be no Plessy versus Ferguson. There would be no 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. There would be no Voting Rights Act. There'd be no Housing Act. There'd be no Civil Rights Act. There'd no be integration laws. There'd be no anti-discrimination laws. All that law wouldn't exist, but it obviously does exist. And the reason it exists is to prevent society from being racist, so we create laws against it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's all that means whenever it says systemic racism. Why is racism systemic? Well, it's because it exists in the systematic DNA, the binary code of society, which is its law. You might not think that's true. I kind of don't think law is the DNA, but legal scholars certainly do, and lawyers do, and judges do. And there's some good reason behind that, right?
Okay. So what's the ultimate end of critical race theory? Is it to bring on change, or more of the study of the past to see how things got to where they are now?
Yeah. I think critical race theorists on this point are a bit divided. So I think there's sort of three prevailing views within critical race theory amongst the theorists who are doing it constructively. And I think it's important to say this because, if you have a Thomist, a Franciscan, so a Dominican, a Franciscan, and a Jesuit sitting having a beer together. The fact that they like beer and are all professed religious Roman Catholics, that might be about as far as they get on agreeing on major issues of the day, right? And they have had productive disputes for a long, long time. The Mendicant orders, the originals, right? The Dominicans and the Franciscans. Yeah. They had wars internally. The Franciscans have almost not existed because the Franciscans couldn't get along with Franciscans. Father Francis tried to settle and enter these disputes and which rule is the right rule and all that. So critical race theory is not nearly as old as the Franciscan order or the Dominicans or even the Jesuits. It's only about 50, 60 years old now. But it has some good variety internally. And I think that's one important thing, is to realize that schools of thought don't all represent a singular mode of thinking. There are some critical race theorists, these tend to be the ones who I disagree with, who believe that legal analysis comes with immediate prescriptive transformational requirements. And so whenever they make a legal argument, they believe that it is kind of a package deal, that it comes with a normative argument and a set of prescriptions in terms of social change and activism. And so they kind of blur the line between scholarship as legal scholars and activism in many ways. And they make powerful arguments for that. And they have some powerful examples as well for that. And I think law is the slipperiest of these, because you have someone like Bell, who was in the courtroom and is also, though, at the lectern, in the classroom. And so that's one school of thought. There's another school of thought that really understands it historically, like you were saying. So they see critical race theory as, in some sense, almost a bringing a historical counter memory about law and race into prevalent discourse. And so preventing a kind of ahistorical whitewashing of American law from happening. And so these people operate, I think, more through a kind of reconstruction of history. They tend to branch off, though. So people like Ibram X. Kendi wouldn't call himself a critical race theorist. He calls himself an anti-racist, but he's really like an intellectual historian, and that's the kind of work he does. There's a third camp, and that's the camp that Bell understood himself as, and this is the camp that I probably and most sympathetic towards. And it's simply the view that the goal of critical race theory is to provide an analysis of the law that has heretofore not existed before. So, in other words, it sees CRT as an analytic lens that we can use to look at the law in a way that without it, we wouldn't be able to see it as. And I think that is the most productive, in my opinion, as I'm speaking here as a scholar, way to understand critical race theory. I don't think one has to agree with its prescriptive, maybe, or even its normative arguments in some cases. And one doesn't necessarily have to accept its entire historical accounts, although in that case, you just got to compare evidence and see what you think. But what I think critical race theory does, and what Derek Bell did in Race, Racism, and American Law, is it gives us a new lens to look at the law that shows us that a lot of laws that don't on the face of them seem to be related to race actually have realistic effects on questions of race. For instance, housing, redlining, all of those kinds of, zoning laws and stuff. They were income levels, even drug policy and drug law. They notice how, crack cocaine had a much higher rate and much more severe punishments than just polite society cocaine, Scarface cocaine. And they were like, well, what's that all about? And then they looked and they said, well, it turns out that the attorney who's doing a rail to stay up all night is ending up with, a slap on the wrist, and the crackhead, is ending up with 30 years because they had more than a gram, and now that's distribution. Well, is this really having the effect we want it to have on drugs, or is this about race? Well, that's a good question, right? And that's what I think critical race theory is really good at, is it allows us to look at laws that don't even seem to be related to race and to see the extent to which many times they do have effects there.
Okay. Since this is a Catholic show, I got to ask, how does CRT, I guess, fit into Catholic social teaching?
Sure. Well, I'm Catholic too, as
absolutely,
you know.
Absolutely. No secret there.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Some may want to know. That's why I wanted to ask.
Yeah. I'm a professed Roman Catholic, and I accept everything the Church and the Magisterium teaches, from dogmatic to prudential teachings on faith and morals. And because of that, the tradition of Catholic social teaching, of course, is a tradition from the 1890s, 1893, I believe, Rerum Novarum, all the way to Fratelli Tutti, which just came out last year. That deposit of papal documents, papal encyclicals, constitutes this very rich, but in terms of our church, quite young set of teachings. Most of ours go back 500, 600, 700, a millennia. We've got a few that are over a millennia and a half, right? We get to our scriptural tradition, Jerome's Vulgate, late 4th century. Catholic social teaching is really the church after Vatican I entering into a dialogue with the modern world it had not had explicitly up to that point, and entering into questions of labor, questions of moral issues of the day, responding to things, and taking a chance. I think that tradition is a courageous tradition, because the church, in some ways, didn't have to be explicit about these teachings and could have still taught them, right? It's not that we didn't care for the poor or feed the hungry in years past, but it really took a chance to enter into a dialogue with the modern world and talk about these things. And my belief, as someone who's read from Rerum Novarum to Fratelli Tutti, including not only the encyclicals, but also a number of the apostolic letters and the kind of minor documents of that, who's read through Vatican II, who's read through the Episcopal Councils, Medellin, Puebla, many others, it's very difficult for me to think that someone would read Catholic social teaching, in particular the principles on human dignity, and the dignity of human life, and the radical equality and sacredness of all human beings before God, our radical fratelli, our brotherhood and sisterhood as human beings. it's very difficult for me to think that someone who holds those views would read critical race theory's analysis of the law and say, oh, these are two different things. No, I think that if you accept these premises of Catholic moral teaching on human dignity and our equality before God as brothers and sisters, our fallenness, our sinfulness, all these things, this goes a bit further than social teaching. This gets us into moral theology, right? Original sin, even the sacramental practice of confession, where even though I am forgiven by the priest in persona Christi, I still have to suffer temporal punishments, right? If I'm guilty of a crime, I still have to submit myself to the law and obey that law. These teachings of the church are consistent, I believe, with the abolitionist core of critical race theory. There may be differences on prudential judgments, especially when we look at some of the prescriptive claims maybe that come out of certain judgments. There may be risks of over and under determinations, for instance. But I don't see critical race theory and Catholic social teaching as either or. I really see critical race theory as an opportunity for those who are nerdy enough, wonky enough, whatever you want to call yourself. If you're reading Supreme Court cases, that's you. I do that, so don't feel bad. But if you're into that stuff, then yeah, critical race theory, I think, helps a Catholic understand our law with an eye towards human dignity in this country. Now, if you're not American, and these aren't the laws that you have to read. You know, if you're Italian or you're from Denmark or you're from the Philippines or you're from Singapore, no, critical race theory isn't going to do you any good because it's really a commentary on American law. So for American, United States of America, American Catholics, critical race theory, I think, is a powerful tool that will help us in understanding Catholic social teaching. One thing about Catholic social teaching, though, is that it generally talks about racism very rarely. Francis inserted it into this last encyclical, but like people are shocked, but like Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, John Paul II's 1995, that was the first encyclical to use the word abortion. 1995. So sometimes these words come into our vocabulary slow. It doesn't mean for a second that the teaching on the church's teaching on abortion didn't start till 95. No, not at all. It existed well before that. And it was politically active well before that in terms of advocacy and petitions and stuff. But, you know, Francis used the language of racism. But in the United States, the language of racism I often find is generic xenophobia. Right, which is more like hatred of the other, fear of the other. But what critical race theory does is it shows you that, yes, xenophobia is bad, but there are types of xenophobia that have a very particular expression that's even more narrow. So the institution of slavery in the United States has a very narrow application, and it was used with an exclusive eye towards African Americans. And that's what those laws were largely built for. Now, is there immigration law that mirrors some of this? Yes, but by analogy, I would say. And I'm saying this as a Mexican American myself. But the racial prejudice that this country's economy and law was built upon was not generic xenophobia. It was anti-black white supremacy. And so for me, what critical race theory does is it attunes the anti-xenophobic anti-racism of Catholic social teaching, as recent as Francis's document, and it focuses in on this particular element of anti-black racism in this case.
So why do you think there's so much pushback on it?
Well, I've got a kind of funny curiosity about that. Critical race theory starts as early as 73. It really gets going in 1980. It doesn't start spreading till the 1990s. And last time I checked, it's 2021. Mm-hmm. So I have to say, I'm as shocked as anyone that all of a sudden in 2021, critical race theory, which has existed since the 1970s, became a hot button issue. And I have to say that people like Chris Rufo, James Lindsay, others, they have been very open about the fact that they're not actually, in fact, David himself, on my show, Folk Phenomenology, watch the debate when you get ready, he openly admits that the thing we're talking about, when we're talking about critical race theory today, has very little, if anything, to do at all with the legal theory that was begun in the 70s and 80s or what have you. So the burden of proof, I think, is on the critics to say, why are you using those three words together as an abbreviation, CRT, when you're not talking about that? I think what's being talked about today, to be frank and honest, is the same thing that political correctness, social justice warriors, wokeness, there's been a recurring addressing the accusations of Marxism and things like that. You can actually look at people calling Martin Luther King divisive, a Marxist, a communist, all of these things for advocating scandalous things like race mixing and racial intermarriage and civil rights and things like that. So I actually don't believe, I'm on the one hand surprised that critical race theory made the newspaper headlines because it kind of has been around for a long time. But I'm also not surprised because the aftermath of what I think we have to not be cynical about, at least those of us who ascribe to the views that I hold. George Floyd was a disaster on the national conscience, and it raised our level of debates to the levels of Rodney King and Martin Luther King and these moments in American history that we've had to, where people have had to hit the streets, and even, things have had to be felt at a deep level of national conscience. And you know what? The guilty verdicts and the sentencing and the aftermath of outpouring of social sentiment, I think, was a positive step in the direction of racial progress. The problem is there's been positive steps since Pennsylvania became a free state. And so it's a positive step. Washington freed his slaves at the end of his life. That's a positive step. But he wasn't Abraham Lincoln. Right. So, this was a positive step. But one of the things that critical race theory is very sensitive to is that every positive step with regard to racial progress always produces a backlash and a reaction. And I see the critical race theory discourse as exactly that today. It's the equivalent of Plessy versus Ferguson after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I believe it's simply a reaction against racial progress. And if we look at the archive of history, and if we look at the signs being held in front of schools today, and look at the ones that were held in 1954, you're going to read the same exact slogans, and you're going to see the same exact constituents outside of them. And that's how I interpret the so-called controversy of it today.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So anything you want to add on CRT before I let you go to enjoy the rest of your day? Well, your sabbatical.
You know what? First of all, I would say Gloria Purvis just released, I thought, a great episode on her podcast, the Gloria Purvis Show, on critical race theory and Catholic social teaching. That is worth looking at. What I want to say is, I don't think anyone should care too much about critical race theory if you're not a legal scholar. Like, to be honest, I don't think it's very important for people who don't do legal scholarship to know critical race theory. I don't think you're a racist if you don't know what critical race theory is, because you're not a legal scholar. In the same way, if your son or daughter is learning critical race theory in school, they must be in law school. And congratulations, that's a huge accomplishment. But they're not in third grade learning legal realism. No one teaches legal realism in elementary schools or high schools, to my knowledge. Critical race theory is a theory like the Frankfurt School or like any other of the big theoretical lenses used in graduate studies by scholars. But it's not something, you should get too concerned about appearing on a curriculum elsewhere. It's like phenomenology. That's my area. And no one should be scared that they're going to teach phenomenology in high schools, because no one should learn phenomenology in high school. If you want to learn philosophy in high school, you need to read your Plato, and you need to read them plain, without isms or ologies. Just learn the Euthyphro and find out who was Socrates. In the same way, I don't believe people really need to know much about critical race theory and agree or disagree one way or the other if they're not legal scholars. Well, what they do need to be in touch with, I believe, if they're Americans, is the Black intellectual and artistic tradition. And so people like Frederick Douglass, people like Ida B. Wells, people like W.B. Du Bois, people like Carter G. Woodson, people like Martin Luther King, people like Maya Angelou, people like Toni Morrison, a fellow Black Catholic. Those are the authors and people that I think we really need to pay attention to, and who we should have we have less excuses to be ignorant of. But to me, critical race theory is not very important unless you're really trying to, in a rigorous, analytical way, understand American law.
Sam, where can our listeners reach out to you or check out your other work?
Well, you can find me at Sam Rocha, SamRocha.com. Right now, it's kind of podcast all the way. So, folk phenomenology, I would really just appreciate it if people would take a listen to that. I'm going to have a lot of guests on my show who are representative of the kinds of views I've shared today. There's some differences of opinion as well. I also am debating David on there on this very issue of critical race theory, and I have a whole monologue 2-hour episode where I walk through the history from the Canary Islands in the 15th century, before Columbus got in a boat, all the way to critical race theory and the aftermath. And of course, the people working in philosophy of race who get almost no credibility or attention, not that I'm sore, but who I think have a lot to bring to the table. People like Cornel West, for instance, and many others, Jorge Gracia, who's also a wonderful Catholic, who have been dealing with issues of race, but maybe not in a way that makes it on the newspaper. And so you can look forward to that too on my show. And Gloria Purvis too.
All right, great. Well, Sam, thanks for your time today. Just talk about this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, William. I always love that a lot of people say both sides, but very few people do it the way you do. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. God bless you.
Yeah, you too.